Well, here we go. Thank you for coming back after the coffee break. We're on the 7th panel now. We've already talked about the regulatory framework and some of the difficulties and challenges inherent in transposing regulations and norms and policies, and we've talked about the mobility of the future, and obviously the users want to know what some of the on-the-ground aspects are going to be. Is it going to be costly? Is it going to be affordable? We're going to be talking about the new mobility schemes, and we're going to see how Xavier Ferrer, who's partner at the Ernst & Young's consultancy, is going to moderate this panel, and he's going to initiate the debate. So go right ahead, Xavier. Thank you so much for being here the second day. It's a pleasure to have you, Jesus, as the MC of this event. Over the past day and a half, we've been talking about the industry at large, about the regulators, we've talked about cities, and this panel is going to focus on something entirely different, which is the users of vehicles and transportation systems. And we have 4 excellent speakers, and we're going to be hearing both English and Spanish on this panel. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth from English to Spanish, and I think that's an advantage that we have an international number of speakers. We have Ian Stone with us, Australian Automobile Association, and we have Oliver Schmerald, who is the CEO of the FIA, Manufacturers Commission, and then we have Jorge Delgado and Marta Blázquez, sorry. So
now I'm going to introduce each of one and give them the opportunity to make their initial speech. The first person that I would like to introduce is Ian Stone. Professional career, Ian is an experienced senior executive with over 30 years experience in senior corporate roles in Australia. Until the 1st August 2022, he had spent the last 15 years as CEO and Group Managing Director at Royal Automotive Association of South Australia. Ian is now a non-executive director on RAC Insurance, a doctor-owned medical indemnity insurer, and chair of the FIA University Board. He is also consulting to a number of business with a focus on innovation and growth for the future. And also let me add that you start your career in EY, and it's good to know. Ian will focus his initial intervention on the user, a major player in the new mobility. And please, Ian, it's your turn.
And my discussion will focus on a bit of an Australian aspect, but hopefully you can see the parallels to Spain and other parts of the world. So in Australia, obviously, we're going through the same discussions that you are in Europe, and EVs are dominating the solution that's being put forward by a number of people. But one of the starting points from a consumer point of view is a lot of people today in Australia go back to this quote from Henry Ford, which is basically, my customers are too stupid to know what the future could look like. And that was probably true in 1900. But today's consumer is very different to the consumer back then. Today, I think we see on our television screens, our news programs, what the possibilities are. So in Australia, the discussion around hydrogen versus EVs is quite well known across the community. Also, the discussion around drones. So news at the moment, we get a lot of reports about how drones are being used in the Ukrainian war. So people are much more aware today of the possibilities and what the future could be. And so it's really important that we take the consumer along with us on these journeys. And if they don't believe us, they'll push back and reject the solutions that we put forward. So today, we're not asking about faster horses, we're talking about how technology is part of our everyday life. And really, the mobility clubs can be an important partner for all those involved to take the consumer on a journey. We tend to be, in our respective countries, well respected by our members, who are a large part of the consumer base. So the club that I used to work for had 780,000 members in a state with 1.2 million licensed drivers. So we had well over half of the driving population were our members. And the automobile clubs in Australia have a history of taking on difficult conversations with our members and leading the conversation, even though it may initially be unpopular. So in the 1970s, we led the way for compulsory seatbelts in every car. And at that point, it was seen as very negative by the consumer. But they trusted us, and they trusted the message that this was about their safety. So we think we can be a really strong way to the consumer for the messaging, provided we believe in the message that we're giving. And I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's quite unique for Australia. And it explains a little bit why yesterday, with the presentation from EY, you saw the demand for EVs in Australia is about half what it is in Spain. So the blue mark there marks the road from Adelaide, which is where I live, to Perth. It's nearly 3,000 kilometres. It's actually approximately the same distance from Seville to Vienna. And in March 2020, Jorge and I did that drive. We took 3.5 days. But 900 kilometres into the drive, so just after the first stop, you come to a little town. It's got less than 100 people in the population, and there's a supermarket there. And there's a sign outside the supermarket which says, "Last supermarket for 1,000 kilometres." But it's not only the last supermarket, it's the last time you see an electricity power grid for that 1,000 kilometres. So when we stopped the next night in a town with a population of 6, where all that's there is a petrol station and a motel, the electricity that we were using in the motel rooms or when we were dining was actually generated by a couple of diesel generators that the family that own that place keep running. So there is no electricity into that town from the grid. Our current federal government, as part of their election, said they're going to put EV chargers approximately every 100 kilometres on that road. The problem is, not only do they need to build the EV charging network, they need to build an electricity generation capability to feed those chargers. So as a consumer, what you've got to convince me is not only that when I get there, if I'm driving an EV, that there'll be I won't be queuing up for an hour while 2 other cars in front of me charge, but actually that there's going to be electricity going into this charger because where is the power coming from? So it's quite a unique Australian perspective. I'm sure if you drove from Seville to Vienna, you wouldn't have 1,000 kilometres without any power anywhere. So the consumer in Australia is very much interested in the future and the new directions and where we're going. They really want to do something about the environment and climate change. But there's some conditions on it. So they'll pay a certain amount to help, but as soon as it starts impacting on their lifestyle, it's about me and my financial situation is more important than the greater good. And we saw that last week. I read a report where demand for EVs in the UK has dropped over the last 2 months by more than 50% because the consumer is concerned in the UK about inflation and what that's going to do to the price of electricity. My safety is important, so most of the EVs in the world are actually produced in China, but at the moment, the safety rating on those is a 3-star at best, whereas of course the European, the Koreans, the Japanese are producing 5-star cars. So all the demand in Australia is for those 5-star cars, but they come at a much higher price. And in Australia, we drive to what we believe the regulations are or should be. We don't actually necessarily drive to the stated regulation. So a common myth in Australia is that when the speed limit's 110, the police won't pull me over if I'm doing under 120. So there's this leeway, because that's what we believe the regulations are. But I'm also more mobile around the world. So I didn't come here today on an electric plane. I came on an Emirates flight. And so I still want my mobility. I still want to be able to travel around the world. So there's a need to not just convince me that EVs are changing my environmental impact, but also what am I going to do for the future. And if you look at today, the owner of Tesla, the biggest EV company in the world, is also owner of a company called SpaceX, and I guarantee you he's not using electric power to try and get himself onto the moon. So consumers in Australia, and I'm sure it's not the case here, have a very poor view of politicians and regulators. I said earlier to someone that in Australia we believe we're the most over-governed country in the world because we have 3 levels of government: federal, state and local. But I must say, I think the Spanish have beaten us because you have the European Union on top of that, so congratulations. So they need trusted sources of information, and I think we're seeing a move in Australia now with the push for EVs, particularly from politicians and companies with a self-interest in delivering EVs. The questions are being asked: if my electricity is generated through burning coal, how am I actually truly helping the environment? So I think there is a desire to help the environment, but a cynicism that goes with that it's not being delivered by one solution only. And again, I don't want it to be hard for me, so you've got to make it easy. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And now I want to introduce Oliver Smerroll, CEO of OAMTC and President of the FIA Manufacturers Commission. Oliver is an engineer from the Vienna University of Technology. He is the current CEO and Managing Director of the Austrian Automobile Club. After working for several technology companies, Oliver has been at the head of the Austrian Club for more than 11 years. Oliver, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. Good morning from my side. Yes, ÖMTC, hardly to pronounce, is the mobility club in Austria. We have 2.4 million members, and definitely we are one of the most trusted brands in the country, and therefore also what we are saying in terms of the future of mobility has a certain weight in the public discussion. So for my short introduction today, I have 2 different topics I want to address. The first topic we heard already a lot about yesterday. It's about what is needed for the transition, and can EV be the only solution for what we need to achieve. And on the second part, I would like to present to you some surveys, what consumers in our country, but I think it's not that much different to other, at least European countries, are thinking about battery electric vehicles. But let me start with some additional comments and thoughts of what we heard already yesterday. And I'm very thankful in particular to Mr. Ratti yesterday, who made a very precise analysis why battery electric vehicles alone won't help us or bring us to the target of climate neutrality in 2050. And we all know what are the regulatory framework we are working in, and several countries in the European Union have stated that already by 2040, they want to have a net zero emission mobility in their country, which would mean in a very pragmatic calculation that the annual growth rate of battery electric vehicle new car sales would be in the range of 35 to 40% with an exponential growth. So something which on the one hand there's a lot of doubt that the industry can provide this number of cars. Secondly, that the infrastructure will be ready for serving these cars. And thirdly, and not to forget, that the people can afford to buy these cars. So to count only on battery electric vehicles to achieve the climate targets in the mobility sector is a very, very high bet, which we believe won't work out. So one of our main messages also to the policymakers in Europe and in Austria is that please keep the technology debate open and let other technologies compete against battery electric vehicle to find out what could be the right mix of solutions which bring us to the net zero emission target. And it's all about energy. It's not so much about the propulsion itself, it's really about energy. And if you look at the world demand on energy, you see very clearly that not only that it is still growing, but that more than 84% of the global energy demand comes from fossil sources at the moment. So we are not talking about bringing some battery electric vehicle to the market. We are really talking about completely transforming our energy system worldwide and in Europe in particular. So having to transform that means that in future there will be a huge demand on renewables, knowing that today only 17% of the total energy demand is in the electric format. So most of the energy demand at the moment is still in other forms of energy. So first we need to transform the industry, we need to transform the warming of our houses, and we have to transform the mobility sector. And only then we can look forward whether we can achieve what we would like to get. And the renewables overall at the moment is only 3% of the total energy production. So there's a huge to do. And yesterday we heard a good comparison what means electricity compared to fossil energy. Having said that a 75 kilowatt hour battery capacity equals to 20 liters of gasoline or diesel. And I would like to put another comparison which maybe highlights it in another format. If you think of one of the largest wind parks we have in Europe in the Eastern Sea, and this wind park with 60 huge windmills would operate for 17 months. It would only produce the energy which you could put into one big natural gas tank ship. So just to highlight that the density of energy, of electricity, is by far too low to provide, to store it and to transport it to where we need it. So the message is renewable energy is important, but renewables are not in the right format to store them, to transport them. And so at the end we need carbon. So we should not talk about decarbonization, we should talk about defossilization. So we should not use anymore the carbon which is still in the earth, but we should, and we will need that carbon which is already in the atmosphere to bind the energy to a better way. And if you have an interest in what is the energy production actually in your country, you can look at this website, and here you see in real time the CO2 footprint of the kilowatt hour which is produced and consumed in your country. And I had a look at it yesterday, And yesterday in Spain, the kilowatt hour of electric energy was produced with more than 250 grams of carbon dioxide. And if you looked at the same map to Poland, we were above 1,000 grams of CO2. So the dream of having a CO2-free electric energy for our mobility is a dream which is not real in the moment. But let me finish this first thought with one last important item. When we talk about the combustion engine and when we talk about biofuels or synthetic fuels to run a combustion engine on a net zero basis, we often hear that the efficiency of the battery electric vehicle is so much higher than the combustion engine will be ruled out because of the efficiency topic. But is this real? I'm not sure, because if you look at that, and sorry, it's the German, but the numbers are accurate. If you look at the efficiency, not only of the engine, but of the overall chain, so like we discussed yesterday about the life cycle analysis, it's exactly the same idea. If you produce the renewables in the middle of Europe, the efficiency of the energy production is extremely low. And so the upper flow chart shows if you produce renewables in the middle of Europe and then you directly charge a battery electric vehicle by that energy, overall the efficiency rate you could achieve is in the range of 12 to 13%, not more. But if you build the windmill or the solar panels in parts of the world where the efficiency gain is much higher, for instance, windmills in Norway or windmills even in Patagonia, the efficiency gain of the energy production is that much higher that the transformation and the transport and the use in a combustion engine at the end of the chain leads at the same order of magnitude in terms of efficiency. So what we are saying is that efficiency is not only about the engine itself or the well-to-wheel. It's much more. It's if you look at the total chain, and then e-fuels, to come to the point, e-fuels are compatible compared to battery electric vehicles also in terms of energy. And now I come to my second point, with what is the customer's attitude towards battery electric vehicles. And we did some surveys, and what you see here is we did the same survey once in 2019 and again last year in 2021. And what you see, and I'm just highlighting a couple of the answers, is that the environmentally friendliness of battery electric vehicles has declined. So more people than in the past think that also battery electric vehicles are not necessarily environmentally friendly, but they could also be harmful to the environment. So you see, this is something which also comes to the mind of people the more media talks about that. And the interest of buying and driving a battery electric vehicle has declined over the years. This was surprising to us. So only 12% in the last survey claimed that they would be very positive about having a battery electric vehicle, but the number of neutrals and in particular of negatives have increased. So the interest of the consumer of buying a battery electric vehicle in the last years, at least in that survey, has not increased, but in the contrary has decreased. What do consumers see as the main advantages of electric vehicles? They say not anymore the environmental aspect. So environmental aspects, back in 2016, we asked it already back in 2016, more than three-fourths of the people thought that battery electric vehicles are environmentally friendly. today, less than half of the people think about the same way. So also here, the public opinion has rather changed against in favor of the battery electric vehicle. And you see that the main advantage for battery electric vehicles on the very top of the chart is the tax benefits. So this is not coming from the technology, this is not coming from the usage of the car, this is just coming because the states are heavily subsidizing the technology for the time being. And when it comes to the disadvantages of electric vehicles, there's one aspect which came up, and I think we as a mobility clubs have to argue against that battery electric vehicles might be unsafe. So this is something which we don't think that this is the case, but obviously some burning Teslas in the media have caused the impression that battery electric vehicles might be unsafe. So this is something which we have to counter-argue. And the very final slide is about what would be the choice of your next car, which powertrain would you buy? And there's still a majority for petrol. There's a decline in diesel for various known reasons. Plug-in hybrids and battery electric is at 21% in that survey. So you see there's still a lot of variety, and consumers are at the moment left a little bit alone in their decision what they should go for. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And now it's time to Jorge. Jorge Delgado, if you want, you can take the stage. Or if you, it's okay? Okay. Jorge, just a second, Jorge, just to introduce a little bit. No? He's a member of the FIA World Council for Automobile Mobility and Tourism, Vice Chairman of the ARC Europe Group, and CEO of the Royal Automobile Club of Spain.
And I am sure that most of you won't remember, because you are too young to do so, the big crisis of horse manure in 1894. That triggered the very first international urban planning convention in the world that happened in New York. And they were discussing things very similar to what we are discussing here. Because at the time they were very, very concerned about how would cities evolve in the future. And they were concerned because they had problems like typhoid, like dysentery, and actually people were dying because of the health issues that their transportation modes would bring. And in that conference in New York, there were many ideas put forward, and some of them may seem familiar to you, like, for example, defining areas in the centers of the cities where horses would not be able to pass, or to provide, to change consumer technology in the direction of what was then the most familiar mode of transportation, which was steam. And at the time, there were electric cars, there were steam cars, there were petrol cars, and basically it was the technological evolution that drove them forward. If you look at these two pictures, the one on the right-hand side is mainly horses. That was 1900. By 1913, in the Fifth Avenue, you could not see a single horse, which was very good for the environment, and it was very good for health, because, as the New York Times said in 1898, at the current rate, by 1930, London, which was at the time the biggest city in the world, would be covered by 3 meters of horse shit, and excuse my language. So when we look now to the future, and when we look now to what we are trying to do, much as we do now, as they tried to do in 1898 in New York, we are painted a future that has 2 main pillars. The first one is multimodality. So multimodality, we have the electric scooters, we have the bikes. By the way, many of the automobile clubs started in the last part of the 19th century as bike clubs. But I digress. But when we look at this multimodality and pedestrian areas and the scooters and the famous city where everything is within 15 minutes walk, we've heard of this when we do urban planning. By the way, that already exists. It's called a village, and we all know what is happening to the villages in the modern world. When we do this, if we talk to consumers, and that's what we do every day, we talk to consumers every day, they always come with the same questions. That's very great, but what do I do when I have to bring my kids and my wife and we have to do the shopping, the groceries? Or what happens if my grandmother or my mother is sick and I have to bring them to the hospital? Or even what happens when it's raining? Or if the city is very steep? Because every time we see these new forms of mobility, we are having sunshine, it's a flat city, nobody's in a hurry. And you know, all this new mobility is not very new. It has already existed. Yesterday, we heard that we are putting the consumer in the front line and not the car. But let's not forget, nobody put the car in the front. The consumer did. The consumer had a plethora of media to transport itself, to move around, and it coalesced on the car because it is by far, so far, the best solution. There is another angle when we look at the mobility of the future that gets presented to us, and is the battery electric vehicle. I won't get into the details because Oliver and Ian and some of the panelists yesterday got into that, but the problem with the electric car is that this is not the world. This is the world of the 5 top percenters in Spain, and this is the world of the top 1 percenters in the world. Because the reality of the world is much different. How can you charge an electric vehicle when you live in a place like this? And this is just the center of Madrid. I'm not talking about the developing world. I'm not talking about other parts of the world where they need more and improved mobility. And you would say, okay, so we create a network of chargers. And then you end up in the same place where California is ending up, and in the same place where Norway, the jewel of electric Europe, is ending up, which is in people queuing for 2 or 3 hours to get their cars charged, which, by the way, is the same kind of concept that killed the steam car, because the steam cars existed in the first part of the 20th century, but they didn't really progress because you needed to heat up the steam, so you needed to wait for an hour before the car could start moving. So what has been the result? It's been already 13 years. So if you remember my initial chart, from 1900 to 1913, we had managed to do the full transition, at least in the developed world, of moving from horses to internal combustion engines. So the first mass market electric car of the modern wave is the Tesla Roadster that got launched in mass in 2009. So where are we here? Where are we today? Well, today in the US, battery electric vehicle purchases are under 4%. That's where we are. And it's not good news. In Europe, it's more or less the same. Battery electric is around 4.3%. At this rate, it's not looking very successful because we are not bringing the consumer with us, as Ian very nicely said. We are not bringing them with us. And the way the world looks today is this, which is internal combustion engines, because that's the practical and the affordable and the accessible solution to keep the same kind of mobility. And then, when this fails, it's too easy to go back to the times of enlightenment. And we have all heard about enlightenment monarchies and absolutism. And basically, we try to go and to use regulation to do so. Because regulation, I mean, nobody can escape regulation, or can they? Because regulation is a great tool. It's a great tool as a crutch, as a temporary solution for a transition. But if regulation forces too much and goes past beyond a point, what happens is the following. So let's look at the low emission zones. Low emission zones are basically driving the urban sprawl. And the urban sprawl has some very negative consequences for the objectives we want to achieve. First, when you have urban sprawl, public transport, which is one of the pillars that we were told this morning, public transport becomes much more difficult because you have a wider area, so the efficiency of your public transport collapses. It's much more expensive. If it's much more expensive, you need to levy more taxes to keep the level of service. If you want to levy more taxes, then you leave less money in the pocket of the consumer to buy the new cars and do the transition. Furthermore, because the urban sprawl means that the distances increase, then you drive more kilometers. And if you drive more kilometers, well, you pollute more. And furthermore, because of the urban sprawl, basically what you do is that more people drive because you have less density of public transport, and then you need more distance to go anywhere. So actually, overusing regulation is also a risk and would play against the objectives we want to achieve. And we can also go all the way. We can start banning things. But, you know, yesterday, our dear facilitator presented some charts from Ernst & Young that said that only 17% of people would be interested in buying a battery electric car, which is similar to the numbers that Oliver has presented. We ran this test 2 months ago. We ran exactly the same test 2 months ago in Spain, and it had already collapsed to 8% after the price increases of electricity and the consequences of the war in Ukraine and whatnot. And what this is leading at car parks that are actually getting older, which again is going against the target that we want, because an older car park means a more polluting car park, because people are not changing their cars. The sales are also going down. Again, we saw yesterday in the presentation from Ernst & Young, especially in Europe, our car manufacturing industry is going down, and it's going down because the demand is just not there. And if we look at the EU fleet, the fleet is getting older. So we are not replacing very old, highly polluting cars with new, less polluting cars. So basically, what we are creating, or what we are in the risk of creating, is a huge social divide in which we have the top % of the population that can afford and can take the modern technologies, but we have the rest of the population in the world, and I'm not just talking about classes in a single country, but I'm talking about the world that normally uses the chain in which second-hand cars get passed through the chain, and you have the renewal of the park, and thus you have less pollution. What will happen is that we will separate these, the people that cannot afford the new mobility and they don't have the houses and the ability to charge their cars will continue using their old cars and thus polluting, while only the top % of the society will be able to get into the new mode. In the clubs, we are trying to help. The Austrian club has charging stations, mobile charging stations with which we can help battery electric cars to continue moving if they have lost their charge. We are trying to do, as you saw outside, we are trying to get mobility solutions to provide roadside assistance inside the cities. The Dutch club is trying to accelerate the deployment of a charging network across the country, and the German club is even experimenting with new kinds of mobility, new kinds of technology like manned drones. But the most important things we can do as clubs, the most important role that we have, as we had 120 years ago, is to be the voice of the consumer. Because the consumer has to be brought on the trip. We cannot just force the consumer. We have to be pragmatic, and we have to give the consumer solutions, because the consumer doesn't want to move less. They want to have the mobility expanded. And the technology can help us if we pace it in the right way and we provide the right solutions and not a one-size-fits-all. And we all know that this happened, because nobody today would see a fixed landline, or nobody today would still be using the small key phones. But we also cannot expect anybody to be thrown back 50 or 30 or 100 years and get their mobility options limited. Nobody would use today one of these old film cameras. Nobody would. And the only way we can manage that is by forcing people. But we all know what happened the last time we took all the power from people and we forced them to do whatever somebody else wanted. Thank you very much.
Jorge, thank you very much. Pasamos ahora a Marta, Marta Brázquez, vicepresidenta de Faconauto. Bueno, Marta lleva, lo primero, un placer tenerte aquí con nosotros. Marta lleva, te diría que toda la vida, ligada al sector, con múltiples responsabilidades en el grupo PSA. Como os decía, ¿no? Actualmente es vicepresidenta de Faconauto y directora de New.es, que es la... Tenía aquí apuntado Startup, me han pasado, pero bueno, yo creo que ya está cogiendo mucha forma, que es para la plataforma de vehículos usados, ¿no? que estáis que estáis impulsando conjuntamente con el soporte de BVA, Mutua Madrileña y Unidad Editorial. Además, eres la presidenta de Faconauto Woman y miembro del board, ¿no?, de dirección de COE, también del comité ejecutivo de CEPIME, y formas parte, ¿no?, del top 100 del ranking de las mujeres más influyentes en España. O sea, que es lo que decía, un placer tenerte aquí. Y ahora, si quieres pasar a tu intervención.
The Royal Automobile Club of Spain, and to the regional government and the town councils of both city councils of Seville and Malaga. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. And after seeing those pictures that we just saw of 1900 and 1913, and the way things have changed. When I see what politicians are trying to do now is take us back in time and impose regulations, and I think the only differences are the pictures are in color today and they were in black and white then. So all of us that are here today are obviously against any kind of ban or imposition.
Movilidades vienen a complementar, pero
We know that the private vehicle has to be included in the mobility pool, and the elimination of the private vehicle is by no means the solution. And so for us, it's extremely important that the tension not be on the rise, because we know that the future is one of multiple solutions, and we need to hear the voice of our consumers and the final users, and they're the ones that revalidate the decisions that are made, and they are going to be the ones who really pass judgment on those policies.
¿de qué somos? Sobre todo para
I'd like to spend a few moments just talking about what we do at Faconauto in the industry of the official distribution in Spain, in Andalusia. Here you can see the difference between the public and private. In the concession automobile dealerships, we have dealerships that provide over 152,000 jobs and over 1 million in indirect jobs. And just to give you an idea of where we are today in Spain, we have almost 15,000 people working in car dealerships. I don't think we need to overlook the importance of the dealership activity in the employment sector and the local economic activity that this creates, the services, the high added value services that dealerships provide. Not only is it a network, but it's also a sector that has the obligation, and I know the policymakers need to take them into account and not put their activity at risk. Now, just to put things into perspective, here are some figures. We're looking at a market in which we are selling under 1 million cars, under 900,000 actually. For the past few years, we're not going to clone the market. We're not going to dominate the market if we're going to continue along these lines. But if you look at how cars are propelled, that is only a very small amount of or a small number of the cars on the road are electric vehicles. You like it or not, that's the figure. Now we have the higher numbers here that include hybrid cars or plug-in hybrids, and here you get the the numbers. So don't forget that we're regulating and banning fossil fuel powered cars at a time when users are actually using those kinds of cars and buying them. So we're extremely concerned about the EU ban, and we're extremely concerned about the numbers of electric vehicles are actually going down. So that's actually proof that electric vehicles are right now in a niche market. They're by no means the overriding election of the users. And so we've been seeing the number of cars, of these kind of cars that are being sold. And what does this mean? Well, does that mean that we are not, we're denying the electrification from happening? No, by no means at all. Well, if any sector has done their homework in terms of electrification, is the automobile industry. So who are investing in this? Well, we need to see that there is a lack of investment, and that's perhaps why electrification is not becoming as prevalent as it should be. And so, again, if we look at the fleet for 2021 and you look at the electric vehicles that are in the focal point, we can see a couple of things happening. First of all, we have a 38,000 cars. We see the number of cars that are over 16 years old. So if you look at the entire fleet of vehicles in the in Spain, you see that many of these cars are very old. They're not being replaced by newer cars. And can you ban that entire fleet of cars? So really what's happening, and I've just jumped from one slide to the next, says the speaker, but we need electrification? Yes. But do we need to renew the vehicle fleet in our country? That's also a yes. So obviously we're talking about private passenger vehicles that could be sold today, because any older cars are in this pie chart, and whether or not we have enough money to buy a new generation of vehicles is very much in question. So at the end of the day, we're going to be banning vehicles that could be bought today, that is fossil fuel powered cars. But of course, we're slowing down the economy because people are thinking, well, I'm not going to buy a car that is fossil fueled because it's going to be banned in a number of years. And then what we're doing is we're getting a progressive aging of the vehicle fleet because people are not taking that step to renew their car and buy a new one. And then we have these old cars that are higher pollutants, and this is also expanding the entire problem, because the panorama, the scenario is not a bright one at all, because over 50% of the population is actually delaying their decision. They don't know really what to do, because a new car is perhaps needed, but the regulations and the mobility technologies that are in place put them in a place of uncertainty. So over 60% of the population knows that these electric cars have technologies that perhaps is beyond their reach or beyond their economic affordability capabilities. So, of course, if we're putting these kinds of prerequisites, if we're putting these bans in place, what I think we're doing is we're just putting the ball in someone else's court, so that they make the most of these market niches. And we're putting ourselves in a worse position because we're not as competitive as we could be. And I think we're just we're digging our own grave, so to speak, because we are very clear that there has to be a transition, and transitions are what they are. They have to be done gradually, and they have to make sure that they leave no one behind. And if you're not going to leave anyone behind, that means not creating a social divide, not creating a gap in which someone with a fossil-fueled car is going to be without a means of transportation because of a European-wide ban. So of course, we're actually creating a distance or a divide in which entire classes of the population are going to be in a very difficult situation, and only the most economically privileged, the top classes of society, are going to be able to fall within the parameters of the new regulations and abide by the new policies and the new decisions that are made. So it seems that a very confusing situation, because there are so many sectors of the industry that are claiming and clamoring to the policymakers because of this. There are other countries in the EU that are also deciding on these issues. So we need to develop a number of lines of action and objectives that, of course, are aimed at decarbonization. In fact, PANEL-7 is working along those lines, but at the same time, we need to understand that the replacement of the vehicle fleet has to be subsidized. We're providing direct economic assistance to those that renew their vehicle, and we need to have those incentives in place. But of course, this is being drawn out in time, and a lot of the users of these vehicles are not getting their compensation in due course. So of course, incentives have to be done efficiently, and in the Renove plan, which is again another incentive-based program, so we need a Renove plan that is not delayed and is not inefficient. So again, we're clamoring to the government and to the policymakers that we have programs in place that provide assistance, that provide incentives, and provide subsidies for buying a new vehicle. And then we have the VAT reductions. The tax implications of buying a new car also has to be one of the instruments or measures put in place, and it could be a decisive leveraging tool for the renewal of the vehicle fleet. And in addition to what was said yesterday about chargers, we need over 240,000 new charging points in Spain. We would like to know how many of these chargers have over 150 kilowatts power. Very few of those, and so we need those fast charging points, because if someone has to charge their electric vehicle, if they have to wait for a long time for the vehicle to be charged up, if they have to drive all over town looking for a charging point, that's going to be a problem. So I think it's been very clear. The message is we need to make sure that clients have those assurances in place when they buy an electric vehicle. And when we're talking about mobility, what we're talking about is making decisions that keep the clients and consumers in mind. And we have over 400 vehicles on the road that are low emissions vehicles that don't have that label on them. And those labels need to be renewed, because there are a number of incentives in place so that users of those kinds of vehicles have advantages and privilege. And we also have those low emission areas in cities. If your car doesn't have the label, or if it doesn't have the sticker on it, you can't get into that low emissions area. So again, we need to devise systems that are efficient and doable. And at the end of the day, PANEL-7 represents mobility, that it has to be digital technology, and it has to be democratized. It has to be, it's a question of making mobility for all. Not only in large cities such as Barcelona, Madrid, but also in the smaller cities, in the towns and villages, so that people have a range of solutions available to them, and making a decision and having the freedom to choose is absolutely essential for consumers. And whether they want to pay for it or not has to be their decision. Do you want an electric vehicle? Yes. Are you willing to pay a supplement for that? Well, maybe they're not. So we have to provide solutions to our consumers, to our users. We are a very powerful industry. We are a very influential industry, and I think we need to be listened to as new decisions are made in the face of the future. Thank you.